There have been so many great games released in 2025, but some of them didn't quite live up to expectations. Now, not all of the following games are outright bad. I mean, I've had plenty of fun with a good chunk of them myself, but there's no doubting that they all disappointed in one way or another, and weren't quite what they should have been. And with that in mind, I'm Josh from What Culture Gaming, and these are the most disappointing video games of 2025.
Have you ever wanted to watch your favourite content while abroad and stay safe online? Then we've got an incredible deal for you. For just $2.50 a month, you can get Norton VPN, an easy-to-use VPN that won't slow you down, lets you watch your content from around the world, and keeps your online activity safe and private, all with a 60-day money-back guarantee. Scan the QR code on screen or use the link in the description to snag that $2.50 a month deal. Now, back to the video.
Up first, Days Gone Remastered. Okay, let's start off with the least egregious example on this list, but one that's disappointing all the same. It was a bit of a surprise to see Sony announce a remaster for PS4 cult hit Days Gone. While the console maker has taken a lot of criticism for producing unnecessary remakes and remasters this generation, most fans still didn't expect the next one to be Days Gone, an open-world zombie title that Sony opted to not make a sequel to. That said though, it was quite exciting for the underrated game to be shown some love. And considering the original was technically impressive, well, when it was working, featuring a lushly rendered sandbox based on Oregon, as well as an innovative enemy technique that allowed hundreds of zombies to be on screen at any given time, there was the feeling that Sony could squeeze more juice out of the project on the PS5. And the finished product isn't bad by any means, but it makes the cardinal sin of a remaster project, that it doesn't offer an improvement over the original in every area. The Digital Foundry team did a great comparison of the new game and the old, and while there are improvements of course, there are also elements of the remaster that are worse, especially when it comes to the color grading and resolution. The fact that the original, which had a PS5 update anyway, looks more stylish and crisper at times than the remaster just shows how unnecessary it was. Put simply, this one was far closer to the Until Dawn remake than The Last of Us Part 1. Ninja Gaiden 4. Ninja Gaiden 4 also comes near the bottom of this list because on one hand, it's one of the best action games of the year. The combat is blisteringly fast, full of chunky, bloody combos, fun movement, platforming sections, and the kind of spectacle and depth that you'd expect from a Platinum Games title. While it's a good game, however, it's not a particularly good Ninja Gaiden game. Let me explain. The first mainline entry in well over a decade, NG4 feels a bit like another disconnected action game that's added in Ninja Gaiden skins and playable characters as DLC. Tonally and aesthetically, it feels detached from the previous games, not least because former lead character Ryu Hayabusa is relegated to a quick cameo towards the end. A stylistic and even main character change wouldn't be the end of the world if they justified themselves, but sadly, Ninja Gaiden 4's visuals are rather bland and new lead forgettable. Its Neo-Tokyo feels like a generic cyberpunk city, you spend far too many sections fighting your way through drab sewers, and the enemy design isn't up to franchise standards in my opinion. And when you realise that Ryu's levels are just levels that you've already played but traversed backwards, it makes the teased character switch a major disappointment. At least, it wasn't a disaster a la Ninja Gaiden 3, and you can do far worse in terms of a pure action thrill ride, but it wasn't the complete home run that franchise fans like myself were hoping for. FBC Firebreak. It can't be easy being Remedy Entertainment. They have made some of the finest games in the industry, arguably reaching the peak of their powers with the audacious Alan Wake 2 in 2023. But in their pursuit of being unashamedly themselves, they have never tried to appeal to the masses, and as such, games like Alan Wake 2 have released to critical fanfare only to underperform commercially. Perhaps in an attempt to create titles with broader appeal so they can continue to fund these expensive passion projects though, recent years have seen them branch out with multiplayer and live service experiments. The biggest of these was this year's FBC Firebreak, a three-person PvE shooter set in the Control universe. Now, the pre-release trailers didn't look all that impressive, but respect for the studio was so high that fans hoped there'd be more to the game than first appeared. Surely, the minds behind Control would be able to put their own spin on a PvE shooter. Surely. Unfortunately, the finished product was just as bland as it first appeared. Struggling to stand out in an oversaturated genre, FBC was dead on arrival, with those who gave it a chance not sticking around to see if future content drops would improve things. It'll go down as an odd misstep in the company's history, and it's no surprise that the CEO of Remedy stepped down after the game led to sharp financial losses for the company. Rematch. I don't think anyone expected the next slow clap game, the devs behind the brilliant Sifu, to be an action football multiplayer game. But if anyone had earned the right to experiment, it was this studio. And the premise did look solid, with 5 players on each team duking it out across an exaggeratedly colourful football pitch, with the emphasis being on good old-fashioned arcade fun. Things started to look a little wonky with early playtests though, which pointed out various problems and bugs, and sadly a lot of those made their way into the finished game. An unintuitive control scheme, balancing issues, and the lack of cross-play functionality left fans feeling like the game had been rushed out at the last minute, with the live service elements leaving a sour taste in the mouth and not helping the general sentiment that the game was trying to squeeze as much money out of players as possible. There was clearly a solid title underneath all of these issues, but the whole thing needed more time in the oven, even if just to make sure the servers actually worked properly on launch. Far more polish and features were expected, which left Rematch fighting an uphill battle. Let's hope they can turn it around. Killing Floor 3. The downfall of the Killing Floor franchise must be studied. The original game was a rough gem, an early co-op horde shooter that excelled thanks to its impressive atmospherics and blood-splattered presentation. While the second game in the franchise lost much of the grimy grindhouse appeal of the first in pursuit of making it a more accessible and mainstream experience, it still provided a great PvE playground for shooter fans in the early days, with a drip feed of content keeping modes and maps robust. Then crept in the greed, however. As Killing Floor 2 got into its later stages, it leaned more heavily on microtransactions and slowly ramped them up to the point where the game's storefront was just a complete mess. While a lot of these extra purchases were purely optional and cosmetic, it did start to feel like the focus from the devs was on keeping the store populated rather than focusing on the game itself, which lost some of the charm and care as it aged. Then came Killing Floor 3, a full sequel nearly a decade in the making. The issue was, despite that lengthy gap between installments, even more time was needed to cook up a worthy successor. The sequel was a buggy mess at launch, with fans and critics lamenting the lack of content in the base release and the general feeling that it was an inferior version of the second game. The consensus was, it's been 10 years and this is all you have to offer? In the months since launch, the worry in the community is that Killing Floor 3 has been left rudderless, undersupported, and left by the wayside. Little Nightmares 3. Little Nightmares 3 didn't stand much of a chance of being a grand return for the franchise. The first 2 titles were well received, but the announcement of the third game was overshadowed by the reveal that the original developers, Tarsier Studios, would not be returning for the sequel. Instead, main dev duties were handed over to Supermassive Games, who, while having some experience with the franchise, having overseen the Enhanced Edition current-gen ports, are of course better known for their narrative-driven titles like Until Dawn, The Quarry, and the Dark Pictures anthology. And it's not that a studio can't make a pivot into another genre, but Little Nightmares 3 is concerned with trying to play the hits and not putting a foot wrong. In one sense, you can hardly blame the developers for trying to not rock the boat and deliver a sequel that attempts to live up to the quality of the previous 2. But the step down in execution and more of the same feeling did make Little Nightmares 3 come across like a holding pattern rather than a true step forward for the franchise. Add in the fact that Little Nightmares 3's new feature, Co-op, was online only and fans were left more than a bit miffed. It didn't help either that around the same time, Tarsier Studios announced a Little Nightmares spiritual successor in Reanimal, which was also focused on co-op gameplay, but critically, would also allow players to play it locally together. It wasn't hard to see Reanimal then as the proper third game in the series, and this as a continuation made more for money than passion. Tales of the Shire, a Lord of the Rings game. There are a lot of cozy games that end up in the landfill every year, but it's not unfair to say that expectations aren't the highest in this genre. As long as the games nail the fundamentals and have a chill vibe, a lot of them can get by on just being a nice comfort for players to escape into for a while. And with that in mind, a cozy Lord of the Rings game should have been an easy home run. The Shire is a perfect setting for this genre. You've got lovable little hairy-footed scamps, you've got a whole load of quirky food and drink, you've got the iconic architecture and lush scenery. Slap a compelling gameplay loop onto all of that and surely you've got a winner. Well, sadly, Tales of the Shire couldn't even muster that, with even die-hard Middle-earth fans being unable to find many redeeming elements in this shallow, lazy cash-in. Sure, it looks good, but that's just about all it has going for it, with every other feature being the kind of mundane waste of time that gives this genre a bad name. The House of the Dead 2 Remake. Finally, we get to the first outright awful game on this list. The House of the Dead games have always had a place in the hearts of older gamers who remember begging their parents for money at the arcade so they could fill zombies full of lead on these light gun titles. The first in the franchise was ported to consoles for a HD re-release in 2023, and while nothing special, it was a fine enough experience. Due to the lukewarm reception though, expectations weren't high when the second game got the remake treatment as well, but there was some hope that the wrongs could be righted and House of the Dead 2 could be a more robust project. Those hopes were dashed when the first reviews came out though, as critics and fans of the original just slated the new iteration. And they weren't wrong to either. House of the Dead 2 is a laughably bad project. A remake that loses all the charm from the original material, features updated graphics that make levels and enemies look like boring, bland slop, and somehow features worse voice acting than a game from an era notorious for terrible voice acting. For lifelong fans, it was insulting, and for everyone else, it just made them wonder why any money was put into the project at all. Granted, the devs probably only spent about a $5 making this, so it's not a major loss on investment really. Mortal Kombat Legacy Collection. Perhaps the most surprising entry on this list, it didn't seem like Mortal Kombat Legacy Collection could go wrong. The re-release offered an extensive collection of titles from before the franchise made the jump to 3D for the mainline fighting games, even including oddities, failed spin-offs, and forgotten ports. Throw in new interviews and archival material and it was overflowing with goodies, an embarrassment of riches for any Mortal Kombat fan. The end result didn't skimp on any of this content either, it's just that the finished product wasn't quite of the quality many were expecting. The first issue came down to the multiplayer, with fans lamenting the lack of crossplay and custom lobbies at launch, meaning that friends weren't even able to challenge each other online. The second major problem was the apparent input lag on consoles, a huge no-no for any fighting game that relies on quick reflexes and inputting lengthy combos. This in particular became a huge talking point online, with fans baffled as to how the developers could have gotten such a fundamental element wrong. Look, it might turn into a great collection one day, but for now, it's far from a flawless victory. Had to get that in there somehow. Gears of War Reloaded. Like many entries on this list, Gears of War Reloaded isn't a bad game, but it's also not a particularly great one. This is, after all, still Gears of War, the seminal third-person shooter and one of the most iconic games of all time. As a remaster project, however, and with it being the first time the series has ever made its way to PlayStation consoles, it left a lot to be desired. When the game was first redone with Gears of War Ultimate Edition, it was a significant release. It felt like a proper overhaul, for better and worse depending on which art style you preferred, whereas Gears of War Reloaded is a more subtle remaster of the Ultimate Edition from 2015. As a remaster of a remaster then, we are getting very granular when it comes to the unique things that Reloaded brings to the table. Sure, there is slightly better lighting and the bumped up frame rate is nice, but considering that the Ultimate Edition also already benefited from upscaling on the Xbox Series X, Reloaded's improvements weren't all that noticeable. Yeah, it does rule that owners of the Ultimate Edition got the game for free, but for players who maybe played that version on the Xbox One and now own another console, the changes weren't significant enough to buy it all over again. Nor did newcomers feel the need to buy in either, with this remaster of a remaster feeling like a footnote rather than a major Gears release. Vampire: The Masquerade Bloodlines 2. The issue with Vampire: The Masquerade Bloodlines 2 is that it should never have been called Vampire: The Masquerade Bloodlines 2. The sequel to the cult hit immersive sim has been decades in the making, with numerous cancellations, developer swaps, and delays in that time, making this one of those mythical sequels that nobody expected to actually release. But release it did at the end of 2025, and the wider gaming world barely noticed it. In part, that's because it's not the sequel that many were expecting. Whereas the first was an ambitious RPG made famous for its player choice, multiple ways to approach objectives, and the kind of intricate systems that made the likes of Deus Ex and System Shock so enticing, Bloodlines 2 was a more straightforward, story-heavy action game, one that lacked the RPG ambition that made so many fall in love with this world in the first place. As such, it could never be viewed as anything other than a disappointment when sold as a direct sequel to the first game, which is a shame. Bloodlines 2 is a solid enough title, and probably would have been received much more warmly if it was a spin-off and titled as such, something both the developers and publishers have agreed with in the months since it released. A lost soul aside. East Asia's video game industry has enjoyed a massive resurgence in the West recently. Some of the biggest games of the past couple of years have arrived from regular staples like Japan, but increasingly from China and South Korea, with the likes of Black Myth Wukong, Stellar Blade, and this year's Wu Chang Fallen Feathers being AAA blockbusters that have left fans smitten. It was assumed then that this trend was going to continue with Lost Soul aside. Heavily advertised at Sony's State of Plays as one of their biggest second-party releases for 2025, it was pushed hard in the run-up to launch. And even without that push, its gorgeous visuals, spectacular-looking combat, and gnarly bosses looked enticing enough on their own merit. It was a disappointment then when Lost Soul Aside turned out to be a rather bland, forgettable experience. Like Wukong, the bulk of what you're doing here is fighting bosses one after the other, with some rather drab and basic connective tissue in between. Unlike Wukong though, those bosses vary in quality massively, and it doesn't take long for repetition to set in because of that. Sadly, the story isn't enough to motivate you through these sections either, as cliched characters, lifeless performances, and more drag the experience down. Lost Soul Aside is fun enough for the first couple of hours, but becomes a monotonous slog the more you play, with its bag of tricks becoming extremely stale extremely quickly. At a discount you might get enough out of it, but for the initial asking price of $60, there just wasn't enough meat on the bone. Doom: The Dark Ages. I was so excited for Doom: The Dark Ages. Doom Eternal is one of my favourite first-person shooters of the modern age, a super tight, focused action extravaganza that asks a lot of you admittedly, but treats you to some of the most blistering, heart-pounding action set pieces in gaming if you meet it on its level. It was always going to be a tough act to follow because of that though, and perhaps because of that, id Software didn't even really try. Instead, The Dark Ages switches out the precise, challenging gameplay of Eternal and trades instead in pure spectacle. This time around, the Doomslayer is ploughing through wave after wave of enemies across massive, open levels, piloting hulking mechs and even riding dragons. It certainly looks more bombastic than its predecessor, but ultimately ends up lacking the substance that makes the first two games in the reboot trilogy just so satisfying and replayable. The core gunplay can still feel good, but it lacks the intensity and complexities of the last game specifically. The new focus on story and cinematics is just a total misstep, never fully justifying taking the focus away from pure ripping and tearing. And then there are the aforementioned gimmick levels where you take to the skies or the seat of a mech, which get old fast, acting as fine enough distractions, but they don't come close to anywhere near justifying their inclusion. You can still do far worse if you're looking for a solid first-person shooter, and new additions like the Saw Shield are genuine delights, but for every step forward the Dark Ages makes, it takes, perhaps fittingly, 2 steps back. Borderlands 4. Borderlands 4 was tipped to be a return for the franchise. Though the third game sold well, it showed signs of fatigue for the long-running shooter series. With this follow-up though, developers Gearbox were taking players to a brand new planet, throwing them into an ambitious open world, and attempting to pack in more guns than ever. And all 3 of those goals were met in the final release, just with one issue: the performance. On both PC and console, Borderlands 4 ran terribly, with constant bugs and frame rate issues that made it a total slog to play. Even worse, it was one of those issues that just got worse the more you played, with CEO of Gearbox, Randy Pitchford, even advising players to hard reset the game every once in a while to help mitigate the problems. PC players were particularly miffed with how bad things got, tanking the user score on Steam. Considering that Borderlands 4 isn't a bad game at all when everything's working, though some die-hard fans may disagree with that statement, it was baffling that Gearbox decided to ship it in this state. Had they given it a couple more months for polish, it no doubt would have gone down so much better. Splitgate 2. If you're going to walk on stage wearing a cringe "Make FPS Great Again" hat and declare that your new game is going to be the best thing that anyone's ever played, well, you better be prepared to deliver a project that lives up to those lofty goals. And unfortunately, that's not what happened with the release of Splitgate 2. Now, the original game was a solid FPS with a cool premise. Essentially, what if you could use the portal gun in Halo? The multiplayer title gained surprise success, giving the devs the ability to use their newfound resources to go on and create a sequel that was supposed to be bigger, better, and a real contender in the genre. Again though, there was only one problem. It was clear that the devs' lofty ambitions outweighed their actual reach, and trying to package the regular multiplayer in with a trend-chasing battle royale suite left every mode feeling underbaked. Throwing controversial microtransactions and the general feeling that the sequel was released early to cash in on the original fanbase, and the immediate backlash to the game wasn't at all surprising. What was surprising though was the studio's response. After releasing in June, the game was quickly pulled from stores and taken back to the beta stage, with the game hoping to relaunch properly in 2026. How the hell did this happen? Avowed. Before Microsoft outright just bought the Elder Scrolls, it looked as though Obsidian was cooking up a game that would give the Xbox a fantasy RPG to go toe-to-toe with the biggest name in the genre. Though set in their own Pillars of Eternity series, Avowed's first-person perspective mix of combat styles, colourful open world, and writing felt like it was being made to grab Scrolls' fans' attention while they waited endlessly for the Elder Scrolls 6. Those expectations were always too high for Avowed though, especially when the game itself never even attempted to be a massive open world with hundreds of hours of content, but rather a more scaled down affair closer to the devs' own Outer Worlds franchise. The issue is though, even on its own terms, Avowed was a disappointing release from the team that once brought us Fallout New Vegas. Though there is a lot to like, especially the meaty, impactful mix of spellcasting and melee combat, Avowed systems are shockingly shallow. Repetition sets in early on, with each open world area throwing up the same handful of activities, enemies, leveling up opportunities, and a minor amount of story choices to make along the way. It makes Avowed electric for the first couple of hours, as there's nothing wrong with any of these systems in isolation, but as the hours tick on, it's easy to get bored as the unsatisfying story fails to prop anything up. Avowed isn't a bad game, but it's one that doesn't leave much of a mark once you put it down. MindsEye. Alright, another outright bad one on this list. You might be tempted to say that MindsEye couldn't have been disappointing because nobody had much faith in it to begin with. And while it's true that the shooter didn't exactly look like GTA 6 from its pre-release trailers, there was still a lot of anticipation to see what the former executive producer of that franchise, Leslie Benzies, would be able to cook up with his new studio. Sadly, though, as you all know, MindsEye was a total garbage fire. Easily the biggest stinker of the year, the title rivaled Cyberpunk 2077 for the amount of bugs at launch. But even if the game worked, unlike Cyberpunk, it still would have struggled. The shooting was archaic, the open world was lifeless, and the story a bland, dreary affair. Despite the best efforts of its lead cast, who deserved so much better than to be stuck with the game around them, the title was never able to capitalize on its near-future setting. The fact that the heads of the studio weren't able to just take the L and instead resorted to conspiracy theories about the game's reception being the result of saboteurs with an agenda just made the whole thing even more embarrassing. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4. It pains me deep in the heart to put Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 on this list. The original Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 was one of the best remakes ever made. Developers' vicarious visions outdid themselves, revitalizing the series by lovingly remaking the original titles, adding in a whole bunch of new customization options, and generally just bringing a level of quality across the board that the franchise hadn't seen in ages. It took a while, but a sequel was finally announced and released this year, but from the get-go, it was clear that this was not going to be as opulent a project. In many ways, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 and 4 feels like DLC for the first game, with the similarities in graphical quality, animations, features, and mode, prompting fans to wonder what was actually new. But hey, the first two games established a solid foundation, so it would be pretty hard to mess up remaking 3 and 4 in the same style, even if it wasn't much different. That's what we thought anyway, until it was announced that the campaign mode for Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4, essentially the series' first stab at a proper story mode with discrete missions, was being scrapped. That's arguably what makes Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4 so beloved to fans, myself included, and the decision to completely change it to the style of the first 3 games' time trial runs felt like one born out of clear budget and time constraints rather than a desire to do the original games justice. When the title actually dropped, it didn't do much to sway fans from this conclusion either. THPS 3 and 4 isn't a bad game, it's still fun enough as a nostalgia hit, but it should have been so much more and feels so far removed from the faithful approach taken by 1 and 2. Call of Duty Black Ops 7. Call of Duty has gotten away with murder recently. The past 5 years or so have seen some great games, don't get me wrong, but it's also featured some of the most obviously rushed and half-baked releases in franchise history, whether that's Modern Warfare 3, Black Ops Cold War, which managed to be alright despite its production history, or many of the seasonal drops along the way. It's been a rocky road. The thing is though, despite how much of a roller coaster it's been, Call of Duty has always been able to get away with it, through a combination of the games being just good enough, and more importantly, the lack of any competition. Not this year though, not in 2025. That's because 2025 saw the cycle of a COD off year begin just a few months ago, as Black Ops 7 was announced as this year's title, following up last year's Black Ops 6, but also being a direct sequel to Black Ops 2. Despite being billed as the biggest Black Ops game of all time, it was clear that Activision was trying to grasp at anything to make Blops 7 feel like a must-play entry, finally addressing the hardcore criticisms of SBMM, movement, and more. It all felt a little hollow though, and a bad campaign mode, fine, but uninspired multiplayer and no new Warzone map at launch didn't sway those on the fence. While it might have done the job in any other year, it just didn't cut the mustard, releasing after the much-loved Battlefield 6 and Ark Raiders. Those two multiplayer titles ate COD's lunch, leading to the first time in 20 years that COD was outsold by another shooter. And you can't say that it didn't deserve it this time. Assassin's Creed Shadows. Once again, I had such high hopes for Assassin's Creed Shadows. Based on the previews, I thought it looked like a real step forward for the franchise in terms of gameplay, with impressively fluid animations, combat variety, a re-embracement of stealth, and a move away from the RPG-style ability spam of Valhalla and Odyssey. And specifically in that regard, AC Shadows actually didn't disappoint. It was great to play as either of the two new main characters with their distinct playstyles. It was just everything else that was the problem. In a case of one step forward and two steps back, which is a recurring theme on this list, for whatever strides the dev team took in the combat, it lost with the open world. Though mercifully more compact than Valhalla, Shadows' world looked absolutely lush, but lacked the feeling that it was an actual living, breathing place. Most settlements felt like mere set dressing, a model village for you to admire from afar. There wasn't much opportunity for role-playing, few genuinely interesting dynamic interactions, barely anyone to speak to, and not much in the way of life outside of the basic enemy encampments. It made what should have been memorable and thriving cities like Kyoto just blend into the background a little bit, the very definition of wasted potential. So those are my biggest disappointments of the year. Are there any that I got wrong and you actually enjoyed? And are there any others that I missed off here entirely? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more content like this, hit one of the videos on screen right now, or head over to the What Culture Gaming channel for literally thousands of other ones.